everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Okay. All right. Hello, one and all. Welcome to another episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. With me today is my good friend and co-host, Dylan. Say hello to the people.
Hello to the people.
And my name is Charles, and the two of us are so happy to be with you guys today for yet another groundbreaking, unprecedented change the format for Friends Talking Fantasy.
Yeah, well, we were having so much fun and we had so much to say about the Poppy War by R.F. Kuang and our attempt to record our single buddy read discussion episode of it like we typically do, and we just realized while we were doing it that the best way to go about things is to produce 2 episodes on it because we were going to run out of time and we had so much more to say.
Yeah, we try and cap the episodes as much as we can to be around an hour and 10 minutes max. Sometimes we get a little longer than that, but definitely under an hour 30. And we were like 50 minutes in, an hour in, and we were like, dude, we have not even left Singard yet. And so we knew we had to just break it into a 2-parter. So,
well,
Dylan, you want to just kind of bring us to where we left off, I guess?
I will in just a second. I also want to give a warning that this episode does spoilers of the Poppy War. So you probably could have guessed that if you've listened to part 1, but if you're a rebel and we're trying to start with part 2 of this whole thing,
if you'd rather skip the Synagard part and get right to post Synagard, then this is the place for you. Otherwise, yes, like Dylan said, thank you. There are spoilers for the Poppy War, just as there will be for part 1. And if you have not read Poppy War and you're considering it and you want to learn more, go back on our channel to an episode called Why We Have to Read Poppy War, where Dylan gives a very rousing pitch of the series. A space rousing pitch of Poppy War that's entirely spoiler free. Definitely want to start there. Then you want to go after you read the book to part 1, and now you're here at part 2. So welcome on this journey.
Well, Charles, I'm always happy to take a journey with you, my good lifelong friend,
I appreciate that. If you like Poppy War and you liked our part 1 and you're here, leave us a review. You know, we always say that at the end, but let's say it at the top while people are still listening.
Yeah, it's on us for hoping that anyone would want to listen to us drawl on for over an hour and then would still like us enough to want to give us a 5-star review. So let's just tell them now before they have the chance to realize that they don't like this.
Yeah, or, sometimes just life gets in the way. You only can give so much time to dedicating to an episode of a podcast. Maybe you only catch the first 30 minutes, even if you wanted to hear more. So
definitely
check us out.
You can tell Charles is the marketing guy.
Interact.
And I'm the one willing to be authentic because I'm the psych guy.
Yeah, I would say that anyone that makes it to the end would be more likely to give us a positive review.
That's
because
true.
They've heard the whole thing. However, I imagine most people are going to break up their listening, and this is just a good way to remind them at the top. There is proven marketing evidence to ask people to subscribe and follow and stuff at the beginning. It's annoying, but it's proven to be effective, so we'll give that a try. Anything you do to interact with our channel at this point would be greatly appreciated. So whether that's through social media or through reviews or through email. So yeah, let's start a dialogue. We'd love to hear from you.
All right, well, let's get to the book that we said we'd be discussing here, Charles.
Poppy War, R.F. Kuang, Part 2.
Well, we're right at where war has broken out. The Federation of Mugen is invading Nakara, which is the empire that Rin and everyone else that we've become acquainted with live in. And pretty quick, we're into a battle where Rin and her classmates are having to fight together against these invading Federation troops. So I guess I can say what happens in it, which is Rin and Nesha end up fighting together, and they've kind of been rivals.
I really like that moment.
I do like that too. They've been rivals for very long, and we get to see this moment where they are both very, very competent fighters. They were in the finals of the tournament together, so you could say the two best fighters in their class, and they have a common enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and all of a sudden they're fighting in sync in such an impressive way. Eventually they get to a point where this big general, who is pretty tough for them to face, is coming in, and he stabs Neja, and Neja looks like he might be dead during this time. And Rin starts using her Phoenix powers despite all the warnings from her mentor, Jang, and also Jang uses his Guardian powers. He's revealed to be one of these big three folks who basically were the reason why the Empire got, consolidated. Be the best way to say that. And
the second Poppy War ended, right, by the influence of the trifecta.
Yes, true. And we get to see Jang come in and be a total, can I say badass, Charles? Is that going to cost us our explicit rating?
That's fine.
You might have to beep that out. He's a total badass, and he just unleashes his Guardian menagerie on them, and
that's true. It's the first time we see kind of a savant of these kind of powers, a shaman. Well, yeah, I know I wasn't saying savant as that's the word, but it's someone who's actually can use this god channeling power in combat effectively, because we've only seen it through Rin, which is very wild, untapped, not sure what's going on, and then we see Zhang step in and effectively put an end to the battle.
Yeah, Riley's getting riled up about that one.
Yeah.
So that is pretty cool to see, and we end up in this situation then where Rin is detained for a while.
Well, she also taps into her god powers again, and there's this interesting where the general's like, I thought you were dead, I watched you die, or whatever, which is some interesting, like, lore building kind of thing. It's interesting that we're reminded that we're in Rin's perspective entirely, which adds a little intrigue to whatever that means, where you thought who died, you know?
True. And I think it's cool to see. We always got the sense that Jang was more than meets the eye here.
Yes.
And I know I personally, maybe you did too, Charles, was guessing before that he was the Guardian in particular.
It wasn't that shocking of a reveal.
Yeah.
He's the
but
gatekeeper,
it is cool to
right?
see.
Yeah.
It is. Oh, is it Gatekeeper, not Guardian?
They call him the Gatekeeper.
Okay.
I don't know if we find it out in that moment or not, but we do. He is the Gatekeeper.
The Gatekeeper, yeah. So sorry about that. Gatekeeper. And, well, we knew the Gatekeeper had the powers that he used.
Yes.
So it's, you can connect those two when he does this. And fun to see it happen, and it happens pretty quick. You can think of some other series where the mentor waits a few books before or more before really showing you what they're capable of.
Right, and then he shows his powers and just buried under a pile of rubble, presumed to be dead.
Mm-hmm.
So
yep.
also a very abrupt end to that phase of her life.
And this is a turning point in some ways for Rin, where she loses her mentor, I would say, not just literally, but figuratively, where she has been weighing the ideas that Zhang has been sending her way, and she was kind of getting to a place where she was like, maybe I shouldn't be using these powers. Maybe there's something to what this guy is saying. But I'll take these poppy seeds into battle just in case.
Yeah, right.
And when
She's
push
like,
comes to
I'm not going to die without trying. So
yeah. So when push comes to shove, she does take them and she does use her powers. So
and she also, when she sees Zhang use them as a tool, also, and when she sees the total destruction of war and Neza gets stabbed and Zhang gets buried in rubble, she's like, I can never allow this to happen. I should have used these powers from the start and could have prevented all this. So she's starting to see that kind of change in her mind where she's going away from her master's teachings.
Yep.
Which she never fully adopted in the first place, but she was entertaining them for a while.
And props to Zhang for even being able to get someone as stubborn and, let's say, focused as Rin to consider all the things he was saying. It's
absolutely
counter to how I perceive her disposition.
Very, very true. So that happens, and then Rin, once she gets exposed as this basically shaman, she gets assigned to the psych.
That she does. And there's an interesting sequence where they don't really know what to do with her, where she's being detained. I don't know how much more we have to speak about that.
Oh yeah, they do keep her drugged and shackled, right?
And
then the Empress sees something in her, and then that's when she gets reassigned, right? Is that what happens?
Yeah, the Empress. So we find out that the Empress has powers. We get a hint of it actually when Rin visits Kide's estate and she sees the Empress, and there's this just feeling when the Empress looks at her where she's like, I would do anything for this person. And in that moment, it's just foreshadowing because we're like, that's a weird reaction.
Rin's not usually one to submit to someone else, especially just with a glance.
Yeah. So something feels off, and then we get this interlude, which I think is the only part where we aren't in Rin's perspective, where the Empress betrays the psych commander at the time, Tyr.
Yes.
And we learn that the Empress has these sort of hypnotic powers and maybe more going on too. So at this point,
she's the serpent, which is one of the which is the last remaining member of the trifecta, right? Is the serpent?
Yeah. I'm not positive on the name serpent, but it sounds right.
Oh, right. Okay.
But either way, one of the trifecta. Obviously, I didn't get gatekeeper right, so that's a blank space in my knowledge on this. But either way, we know she's really powerful here, and she sees this in Rin and assigns her to the psych, which is basically the shaman division of the Nakaran army. And it's got so first of all, she's under
the Viperess. It's the Viperess.
The Viperess.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Charles.
Yes.
So the new commander is Alton. And I realized at the end of our last episode, I was saying it during the outro, we somehow didn't talk about Alton basically at all, even though it was a huge part of this story in the first episode.
We teased them at the end.
Yeah. We left you wanting more. And Alton, up to this point, has basically been more of an idea than a person, really. He's the person who all the masters at Synagard keep saying how amazing he is at everything. And we know he's a Spearly, which is the people who basically faced genocide in the Second Poppy War at the hands of the Federation. And Nakara apparently let that happen. And then we see him briefly early on in stuff we covered in the first episode where he's fighting, and he's obviously really good at fighting, and Rin gets what feels kind of like she's got a crush on him or something like that. It's and
there's definitely like an attraction there, even if it's just like the way you're attracted to like a celebrity. She definitely has that sort of admiration.
Exactly. And she flubs her one interaction with him basically at the academy, which is an awesome moment for Rin in terms of rounding out her humanity, like we've been talking
someone is
about.
So matter of fact and direct and seemingly callous. The fact that she has that like fumbling her words in front of a crush moment, her bad first impressions, it's funny. It's just a funny moment.
Something we can all relate to, and helps build Rin as when she makes these
more sympathetic,
ruthless decisions, we still understand and empathize with her as a person. So then, anyway, back to where we're at in the story. She's training under Alton now, and Alton is this boy wonder commander at this point.
Yes. He's the leader of and we know that he's the leader because the previous leader, Tyr, we just was through his point of view when he got betrayed by the Empress. So we know now that Alton was his number 2, and he's now the commander of the Psyche, and they're just a bunch of fellow shamans, I guess, and they all each channel a different god, and that gives them different powers. But exactly. Alton and Rin channel the same god, the Phoenix god.
Mm-hmm. And we do learn at this point that Rin is Spearly, and that's important, something that maybe you could have started to connect the dots on before this, but this is the first time that they start saying this explicitly in the story, and Alton is also Spearly. So
right,
it's got this interesting dynamic that starts to develop between Alton and Rin, where Alton, he's in some ways almost seems like a big brother, in some ways seems like someone she has a crush on, and in other ways he is someone who holds a lot of these admirable qualities, and he's very impressive, but he's also under so much pressure throughout this time.
Yes.
And he starts to...
Yeah, the more we get to know about Alton, the more our perception of him changes. Mm-hmm. And he basically goes from this like mythical celebrity status to this tragic character, which was a really interesting progression for his character arc.
He's who I was referring to back in the Why We Have to Read Poppy War episode as someone who... It's interesting to watch how Kuang first presents them and then starts to round out and morph our perception without it feeling like the character has gone through some sudden change that would be out of line with what we'd expect.
It's because we were so focused from Rin's perspective. And from Rin's perspective, he was just a guy that was very stoic that could beat up anybody in the tournament. And then he disappeared, and now he's a commander. So it's like, from her perspective, he's this mysterious, powerful, commanding presence. And then as she gets to know him, we get to know him, and we start to learn more about the tragic nature of like how much, like from the nature in which he was raised, and his drug addictions and his hatred, and like all these things. We're like, oh wow, he's actually kind of a bit of more of a tragic tragic character. And
for sure, he's a victim of so much trauma, and the last remaining person, or at least before he meets Rin, he sees himself as the last remaining person from an ethnicity that has faced genocide, and it's just a really... we also learn he's gone through these experiments that I forget the guy's name, but the guy who runs that lab is
the
doing
prison
on him, and
yeah.
So as a child,
I remember it was a name. I started with an S, and he was like a doctor that perform basically like human experiments in wartime.
Exactly. So face these absolutely horrific experiments at the hands of this, I guess, doctor or whatever from the Federation as a child, and has, in part due to that, developed an addiction to opium. And he's a really complex character, and he sometimes shows Rin this kinder side that cares about her, and other times he lashes out at her and even slaps her at times, and it's
and he can be very standoffish. Like when Rin saw her first skirmish and she got frightened and was ineffective in battle. She wasn't able to channel the Phoenix God, and Alton was like, "Don't come back to me until you can actually keep up with the rest of us." And it was very much like a part of Rin that she's trying to belong with this group. She's starting to feel like she can identify these are a group of people that can channel gods and Altan, and she finally learns more about her own upbringing, and then Altan is very cold and dismissive to her until she learns how to become powerful, and she's kind of still toying with that idea of the price of obtaining that power. So it was a real interesting dynamic that takes place in the setting in how do we pronounce this city? Coeur d'Alene? Yeah. Also, I'll say that this book, The Poppy War, is described as militaristic, and I think that these moments in Coeur d'Alene are kind of the beginning of that. It's described as like a militaristic, grimdark fantasy novel, which it falls under those categories, I suppose. But we really start to see these kind of military tactics play out here in Coeur d'Alene, and I think the scene just kind of introduces the psych, introduces the kind of the more military aspects of it, and also gets us more familiar with Altan. That Altan-Rin relationship gets to finally develop.
Exactly, Charles. And the psych is a really interesting idea, yeah. I feel like.
It's like a Suicide Squad almost.
Yeah, it does remind me. I know we both read those comics, so it does remind me of that. The element that's also similar to that is the psych calls the psych bit to it, which is the psych exists, yes, for assassinations, but even more so as a way to contain the psych. Yeah. Because these shamans, they often become more and more emotionally unstable as they deal with having these gods that they summon the power from, who tend to basically just want more and more possession of them as people in their minds.
Yeah, so they either die on the field of battle or get totally taken over by the god that they're channeling and have like a breakdown, and they can't distinguish themselves from the god, and they're basically like these uncontainable powers that could have catastrophic consequences if left unchecked. So they kind of like imprison themselves and keep each other in check and keep that hierarchy going of like, okay, you imprison me and take over, and then that person will imprison you, and they have a sense of community about them.
Exactly. And we get to see this embodied maybe most at first through Suni, who Alton has to soothe at times, because Suni, although maybe 95 or whatever % of the time is very mellow and I would say likable, he worships a god that has gotten more and more control over him, and at times Suni, who's like basically a berserker when he's using his powers, he becomes volatile and dangerous, and Alton has figured out ways to keep him from acting on those instincts that he has, but you can see he's kind of on the edge of the point in which they would normally try to imprison them in that mountain prison, which is Chulu Korik. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Right. It's an interesting concept, but yeah, he's definitely kind of the the warning of what is possible when you have been channeling a god for so long, and he's just kind of like the warning, the telltale signs of like this is someone who's starting to break. But you also see Alton's character. He's trying to hold on for as long as possible and keep his team together as long as possible. He doesn't really accept the idea that they're broken and need to be imprisoned, right? He's of the understanding that it can be controlled and there's no reason to imprison these people or kill these people. Like, we can keep them contained, we can use them, and that this is kind of the beginnings of that, which brings Altan back to that prison to try and to free people to amass an army when we get that desperate. But this is the beginning of like, he's fine, I can control him, we're all good here, even though he's basically pardon this turn of phrase, basically playing with fire.
Charles, were you up all night with a pen and a pad?
No, I thought of it just now. I'm like, am I really going to say that?
I know I've dropped some bad puns on the show too, so it's probably fair game. And
it's a metaphor I'm sure Kuang had a nice laugh with her internally too, of like, oh, this idea of playing with fire. I'm sure she thought of it.
So we... Are you sure, Charles? So then we end up dealing with a situation that Alton gets this great victory using his psych command, which everyone's really impressed with for a little while, until it ends up leading to a situation where Mugen feigns that they're going to surrender and then sends in this group to discuss actually the surrender of Nakara, not the surrender of Mugen. Mm-hmm. And then they just blow up the encampment using this, what looked like salt, but was actually explosives. And it's pretty brutal, and probably the first really, really brutal moment of this.
Right. And Kuang did a good job of weaving in all the pieces to kind of put that together. She introduced the munitions expert. She introduced the use of salt and sugar and as like provisions. And then she had them come in with the white flag. So it was all this kind of build up, which I thought was really well constructed. And yeah, this is again another moment where it's like, just like when Synagard was attacked, now we are at this moment where like all bets are off. what we thought was like, oh, they're under the white flag, they wouldn't do anything under the pretense of a parlay, and then they just go ahead and blow up everybody, including themselves. And that was the beginning of like, this war is not going to be a pleasant one. This is not going to be an easy one. It became very complicated very fast, and it was also Alton's first failure as well as a commander, which was a shocking
thing. And he
thing.
does not take well to failure.
Oh no, this was kind of the beginning of the end for poor Alton.
It's all pretty much downhill from here, and we see him start to become more and more unstable throughout this, though it doesn't feel like it's unstable for the reasons we see with the other members of the psych, sometimes like Suni. It feels more like he just can't take failing at stuff. And I think that it's something that resonates with Rin in some ways. Like, she can understand what's happening, but he's also just making poorer and poorer decisions as this goes on. And
his situation becomes more and more desperate as well, because he was just coming off like a huge victory, and he was getting the respect of the warlords and the public and everything. And then in one move, he lost all that, and not necessarily through the fault of his own, but the other warlords took the opportunity to make him the scapegoat, right? Yeah. So this whole idea of the systematic adversity that they have to face as psych and as shamans, and that kind of was
Spearly.
And Spearly, exactly. So it's all woven into to Kuang's world building as being like, look, here's now, of course, this first failure that was a group decision to let them in now became Alton's fault because he was the one championing, thinking that he was about to negotiate the end of the war because of his great victory on the channels, just last scene. So it was really interesting. Yeah, I enjoy these moments of this contained battle that after this explosion just got really messy.
There's that moment with the person hanging off the building and Rin's watching on, and it just ends like so many things brutally. And
there's like attempts to save them, but it was all in vain. The public fleeing and like trying to trample over each other, and it's the reality of war sets in, and it becomes this very grim, dark moment.
For sure. So we also at this time, Neja comes back, and he's healed up eerily quickly.
Yeah, suspiciously quickly, yes.
Yeah, and he's like, oh, it didn't hit anything vital. And they're like, that seems kind of odd. It seemed to go through in a pretty vital place.
Yeah.
And he's acting like no big deal. And Rin actually seem to be hitting it off pretty well.
Yeah,
when he comes
they get
back.
buddy. Alton's like, he's a spy, and she's like, I'm not sure. And they're the only two that kind of have this understanding. I think Rin is bouncing around. Like a big theme in all of this is Rin's trying to find a group, and if she ever really becomes part of a group, and the psych being one, and her camaraderie with Neza back in Sinigard is one, and she's never really finding a place to fit in. And a lot of her driving force up to this point, she was like, well, like, I could leave, but where am I going to go? I have nowhere to get back to. She's like, I could quit, but this, like, those options are even worse than continuing because I would just be back to where I was as a peasant woman. Back. There's nowhere to go for me. So she's constantly looking to get along, and the only time she ever feels focused is when she's in the pursuit of power, I guess, and conflict. So really just another level of her kind of bouncing around all these people and all these relationships and never quite hitting the mark with anybody.
I think that something Rin's dealing with here is she might not like war, any of this. In fact, I'd feel pretty confident saying she doesn't like it, but she knows she's good at it.
Mm.
And when all the choices seem to suck, when she's actually good at something, it helps her feel like it's to some extent what she should be doing with herself. And it seems like Rin grapples with some of that during this time.
Yeah, her motivations are change throughout this book, but they start with this sense of like, hey, I'm good at this, I can pursue this, I can become more powerful. Eventually they turn into hatred and revenge and all these other things, but for now she's motivated by like, I got nothing better to do and I'm good at this and I see a path to getting better at it. And that's kind of what got her to this point. And now everything changes when she finds out she's Spearly, allegedly. I'm still on the fence about that, but she believes that she's Spearly, and she meets all these other members of the Psych that are in the same boat as her, and she starts to get to know Altan, who she had, I guess, a connection with, allegedly romantic feelings for at the beginning, that kind of stuff. So she's riding this one out.
Something I noticed as we're talking about Alden again with Rin that comes up multiple times, which is an interesting part of her personality, is despite all her ruthlessness and relentlessness, she still has so much desire for validation from people that she admires. We see that in the academy, in Sinigard, when she's especially under Irja, I believe is that's the
tutor.
person. No, not that's Feyric. Irja, I think, is the name of the master who does the strategy.
Oh, strategy. Yeah, him, but also Zhang.
And,
also.
Yeah, and then of course Alton. She's looking for that praise from oftentimes figures who don't want to give that much of it, and Alton falls in that category. And it's almost that piece where you don't get very much validation from someone, so then every little bit of it feels so good. And that's what Rin seems to be chasing from Alton.
Right. It's what we were talking about with Rin as a character, of this balancing her ruthlessness with her vulnerability. With every moment that she is putting aside any sort of, like, she's self-harming herself to study, she's making all these sacrifices in the pursuit of power, but she's also just trying to be told a good job from someone that she admires. It's very true. It's interesting how both kind of pull her forwards. And it's a very honest human approach to Rin's character, which we've been saying this whole time.
Well, maybe we should mention that they go off and they fight a monster at this point,
yes.
which feels different from anything else that's happened in the book. It's an interesting sequence. I think
it's a unique sequence in the book.
I really like the idea that the monster takes the face of Alton during this for Rin, and there's an amazing exchange between her and the monster posing as Alton, where it's doing that because it thinks she won't kill Alton for whatever reason. Whatever monster powers it's using are telling it that. And it says, "You can't kill me," Alton hissed. "You love me." And Rin says, "I don't love you, and I can kill anything." And she does kill the thing. And she's like, "I don't really know what it means that the thing took Alton's form, nor what it means that it
I think the thing was
wouldn't."
grasping at straws, honestly. Rin never had a great connection with anybody. Like, it at first took the form of her, like, adopted, like, her stepbrother, and she already, like, left him behind. So she was like, that's not really working. And then it turned into Alton, and it's like, whoever said that I loved Alton? Like, so it was just a 1-2. And I think the monster just couldn't take, like, what other forms did he have as a choice? I think that's why it was so easy to dispatch Neza, and kind of was the bane, like, Rin was the bane of its existence.
Yeah, Rin
was like, the secret is I just don't love anybody.
It is interesting. Hey, Kid A might have been tough.
Yeah, but once she realized, and it's true, she had to be like, why am I even talking to the kid? I left him behind a long time ago. It's like, oh, because he's a monster. Oh, I can kill it. And then it was like, whoop, changing strategies. Didn't work out
I'm saying Kite might have been.
Oh, I thought you said the
difficult.
kid.
No.
Oh, Kite. Yeah, that would have been a good one too. Yeah, that's true.
It's interesting the monster chose Alton instead. It's also funny for me to hear that your reaction to it is this idea that Rin just doesn't love anyone, so it was the monster is grasping at straws. Yeah. I think that's a totally valid interpretation. It's different from the one that I had, which was, hey, maybe she does have pretty deep feelings for Alton, or at least some of that infatuation where the monster
I think the monster was like, this is the only person in the whole world that Rin had anything you could call romantic feelings for.
Yeah, that's pretty fair.
And so, I think the monster was like looking at the deck and was like, oh, these are terrible options. And just picked one,
Charles, it's like when we play Cards Against Humanity and you just have a hand full of garbage. That was the Chime, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, looking at its options when it comes to Rin. And like you said, the bane
hey, you want to trade a wheat for ore, or sheep for ore? And it's like,
Catan action.
Yeah. It's like, no, I don't want to trade that. And it's like, well, I had to try. That's all. The only offer I had is basically where this poor creature, this monster, was left.
It is funny to think of Rin as basically this monster's kryptonite because she is so ruthless and
never developed a connection with anybody.
Well, all right. Well, I'm glad we talked about that because that's a good moment. So Alton is also super skeptical of Neja throughout all of this, as you mentioned, Charles.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this really poignant moment where they're getting gassed, Rin and Neja, and Rin is getting out of there, and she realizes, oh crap, Neja got left behind, and they're gonna get him. And she tries to go back to help Neja, and Alton stops her. And also, Alton goes back in, and he decides that it's more important to get a prisoner than it is to get Neja. And that causes some tension between those two.
Yeah. It's just like the brutality of war, like you read in so many other books. It's like, hey, you have to kind of step out of your humanity and make a practical decision because we're at war. And that was kind of Alton's philosophy. And Rin is still grappling with her sense of like Neja was worth saving, a friend of mine, and all this other stuff. Like we could have helped him. What good is this prisoner going to do? And it's just one of those consequences of war, and that Kuang presents that it's really great. It's what makes this part of a militaristic fantasy novel, is these kind of ethical dilemmas.
Exactly, Charles.
Yeah.
So then we meet Chagin. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he says Golden Nice is the real target, not Coeur d'Alene where we've been this whole time. And they end up going over to this other place, Golden Nice, to try to see if they can stop whatever's coming there. And they show up too late, I would say, Charles.
Way too late. Yeah, I would agree with that completely. This is by far the most grotesque, grimdark moment in the whole book. Certainly a tonal shift. Even after this bombing of the city, you get into these descriptions, which we know Kuang has a very masterful understanding of Chinese, Japanese history, especially around World War II. And I remember reading somewhere she was like, yeah, I really didn't make that much of what I described in that up. Like that was all kind of from personal accounts from the rape of Nanking. And drawing on that realistic inspiration from actual history into this world, it was a really gory, grotesque, shocking, and disturbing mindset just to be in. That definitely had a profound effect on Rin, for sure.
It's something that is really good to get a perspective on. It's obviously really hard at times to read because of how much Kuang doesn't hold back in her willingness to tell about events that were pretty directly taken from real life history. And, Charles, you and I growing up in New York, getting our education on 20th century events.
Yes.
This isn't something that's really delved into. So I think I learned a lot from getting this perspective and looking into the history behind it.
Right. I think what Kuang makes the part of her inspiration was obviously the history, but also the fact of you can read in a textbook this was the rape of Nanking, this many people died, it was really bad. But then it's another thing entirely to go into the gory details of exactly what took place, and using fantasy as a way to create a world in which a character experiences those things firsthand, and how she takes these fantastical powers and then makes decisions after having lived through that. So it's a really interesting, like, I remember when we go back to our like very first episode of why we like fantasy in the first place, it's just moments like these where you have a character like Rin and then the author gets this opportunity to be like, okay, what would a character capable of channeling power equivalent to a nuclear bomb do if they were like witness something as horrible as the rape of Nanking, So it's like a very interesting dynamic that's starting to cook here in these scenes in how do we say it? Golan Nice.
And like you're saying, Charles, this does such a good job of putting us in Rin's perspective as she is having some changes in her perspective around what is and isn't worth doing. We know she's already prone to ruthlessness, but this drives home the point and maybe helps free her. I don't know if free her is the right way to phrase it. It helps take away any doubt she was really having about what she has to do to get vengeance. And
Absolutely.
It's tough to feel so locked into Rin's perspective while we're going through the brutality of this, and to see a classmate of Rin's, which I think is such a good use of the pieces on the chessboard that Kuang was looking at here. Well, okay, I got to make this even more personal and have stuff actually happen to a character that we're familiar with,
right.
To drive home the point even more.
Right.
And Venka ends up being a person who we get firsthand accounts from of how bad things got in Golan Nice.
Yes. And
it's
relating to I think they're called the comfort women. That's what they're referred to in like the history of the rape of Nanking, and it's just a horrible description. And I think she even says like, you have like just kill them all. Just promise me that you like just destroy all of them. And Kite is there as well. He went through some stuff, not nearly as bad, but he like witnessed it all and had to hide under corpses and things like that. So everyone's kind of there, and she's kind of and Rin is kind of taking in all this information and is making a profound shift in her mental well-being for sure.
Exactly, Charles. Well, I think we've said probably everything we can say about Golan Nice while keeping our clean episode, not getting
without getting into the gory
tag.
details.
Yeah, so let's move along then, unless there's more that you want to say on that.
No, let's keep this party going.
So Rin's all in on Alton's ideas at this point, which are things like, hey, we need to wield as much power as possible, and the way that we're going to do that is we're going to go to this mountain prison and we're going to unleash gods essentially upon this world.
Not only gods, but people that basically mentally broke down so much that they weren't in control anymore of their godly powers and had to get locked up.
Exactly. So unleashing gods that have possessed people. At the point that they're getting locked in Chulukorik, the people basically have lost control of themselves to the gods. They go there. They release Phelan, who was the previous commander before Tyr, that Alton and Tyr actually went to lock away together.
Right.
And Phelan, you can tell maybe there's a bit of humanity left there, but not much. And Phelan ends up escaping. We don't get much more from Phelan in this book, but obviously that's a loose thread that you expect to come up later on.
For sure.
And you kind of get to see, well, first off, we should probably talk about that they find Zhang in
That's the
the
first
mountain.
person they release is Zhang, and Zhang basically is like, "This is a horrible idea." Bye, and like, does he like lock himself back up?
Yeah,
Basically.
so he went to lock himself there.
Mm.
And they basically talk to him, and it's this last moment where Rin has a chance to say, actually, I'm going to
That's
redeem
true.
myself by embracing the ways of my mentor, which were right after all. But
But
Rin
she,
doesn't take that chance.
no, she
And
very deliberately sides with Alton.
that's one of the things that I think sets the Poppy War apart from so many other novels. It's built so well toward the idea that you wouldn't take that chance, but there's still a lot of you, at least, that's rooting for her too, because it's the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also this knowledge that that's probably not going to happen because of how much Kuang has built toward the fact that Rin will not be making the right decision here. She's going to make a decision that we can understand from all the stuff that she's gone through, but one that will lead her down a path of destruction and death.
Yeah, and this is also she even I feel like she doesn't necessarily believe that one person's right and one person's wrong. I think just at this point, after witnessing the atrocities of Golan Nice, she's like, he could be right, but it doesn't matter because these horrible things are happening, and to just let them happen is the worst thing possible. And we need to, even if it means destruction, like let these people out and try and use these as a weapon. And that's one of the main themes of this whole book is the price of power, and
Yep.
is it worth pursuing, like the pursuit of power and the price of power and things like that. And she's like, we need the power to defend ourselves from these horrible war crimes. And then it's like, okay, well, in your pursuit of power, you're just creating more violence. And so it's kind of that scale, and that was kind of her philosophy when she made that choice. Meanwhile, Alton is acting totally out of desperation because we know he's on the edge, and he's always been on the edge, and he needs to believe that these people are redeemable and can be used and saved because he's on the brink of that himself. So he's just suffered these massive defeats, and he's just witnessed Golden Niece, and he feels like this is the last card he has to play, and he is willing to buy into it and believe it, even though it's a really desperate situation. So the whole thing is just kind of a dramatic, you're really not confident that this is the right thing to do, but the characters have their reasons for doing it anyway. And I just think that's a really interesting scenario painted by Kuang in this scene.
That's also well said there, Charles. Like you're saying, Rin is aware that maybe this isn't the moral choice. Maybe this isn't even going to work. She actually seems to, based on her inner monologue during this time, not really think it is going to work.
Right.
But she doesn't care at this point, and we understand why she doesn't care given everything that she's experienced and given what we know about how she was already predisposed to this kind of ends justifies the means type thinking. So I just think it's such an incredible job, and we'll get to this more with the actual end of this whole thing. But it's such an incredible job by Kuang to write this corruption arc in a way that's built towards so well and so throughout.
Incredibly well said. It's a corruption arc, and this is the phase where she's deliberately choosing violence, even if she's not totally bought into it, as a means of getting revenge. It's like it's the beginnings of like she's not turning back at this moment, and she feels this desperation. And this is kind of the beginning of that. So she sides with Altan. They free the former commander, Phelan, who controls like some wind god, and
is controlled by, more like.
Truth. And then that god escapes, and there's like little, like you said, it's a loose thread, and every once in a while they drop a thing like, oh, he was clearly here because it's totally destroyed now. And so that happens, and they're like, okay, so maybe this was a bad idea, but in that moment they get captured.
They do. And after that we get two things really. We get this sense that the Empress has betrayed them, which
Yes.
maybe we're not shocked by after we saw what happened to Tyr. And we also go through more brutality when they're taken to this lab and poked and prodded and experimented on and basically made to be dependent upon these experimenters from the Federation, giving them access to opium and heroin, I believe, at this time too.
Yep.
And it's another part that's tough to watch.
That was
read,
drawn directly from Kuang's military history background. Like, these were things that actually happened in World War II, and these human experiments in the name of science were horrible things that
absolute atrocities
that happened in that time, and she's pulling on that again, weaving it into her novel, and it's just a horrible moment. It doesn't get too gory, but you realize, like, it's set up for exactly the stakes here of, like, this doctor guy is not above just cutting them open and poking at their organs while they're still alive, and that fear is very much alive. And just Alton being back there, there's a moment where he realizes where he is, and he's like, oh no, I never thought I would be here again. And it's just that, like, from Rin's perspective, you're like, oh god, this is the place. And now we're in real danger. Like, so that was very well done by Kuang, something that we were kind of was building up to this moment. And then we're at the end of Alton's arc now, when the prison guard accidentally injects both of them with heroin instead of just Altan, and that's what connects Rin to the Phoenix God. And then she gets that another moment of this no turning back moment of, like, do I listen to the Phoenix or do I listen to Tezra or whatever? It's like, do I channel the fire god at this moment? Which was interesting.
And we've been built up to this moment in a way where we have a good idea what Rin is choosing from here on out.
Yeah. But Altan, of course, makes his choice. He can't, like, they're able to get free because of Rin's ability to call back the Phoenix God, and Alton's like, there's no going back for me. Like, I've messed up so much up to this point, and, like, I'm so unhinged at this moment that I have to just obliterate this place from the planet, basically, and which is what he does.
And he does, and
it's also his mind breaking from the Phoenix as well, which was foreshadowed for every member of the Psycast to face that moment. And the end of Alton's arc is a tragic one. It's just someone that's at least he got to kind of wipe away the price that caused him so much misery. Yeah,
and there's some of what feels like justice in that he's able to do that, but not enough, I guess. It still feels very, very tragic. And Alton just ends up being this really tragic character. So
right, and then he finds out the Empress betrayed them also in that moment, I think, as well. Right? Doesn't it's the scientist that says, like, who do you think told us? And he had a hard time believing it, and that's when he came to that realization while he was imprisoned in the lab. So when he broke out, he's like, I got nowhere to go, nothing to do. I'm in so much pain. This is it.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting
Dr. Shiro, Charles. Right. I looked it up, and
there is something I want to mention just really, really quickly. I know we're coming up on time here, but there's this fun moment where Rin and is his name Shagan, the shaman, Chaghan, Shagan. They have a really quick exchange where he's like, "Of course, the tiles foretold this. It's like this was the prophecy. It wasn't. Golan niece, it was this." And Rin was like, enough. Like, you don't know anything. You can't just retroactively solve the puzzle. Rin's relationship with authority is really unique in the world of fantasy, and I feel like a lot of times in fantasies, like in fantasy novels, characters in the leadership position get away with that. Like a Dumbledore-like character is like, yes, of course, that was the whole time leading you to this moment. And I'm sure Kuang was reading all this like, why is the protagonist taking this malarkey just because they're a person theoretically of power or of leadership. And I think she's channeling through Rin this idea of like, you didn't know anything. And to even suggest that that was the case is ridiculous because you're just making it up beforehand. You don't get to do that. You don't get to, after the fact, act like you solved it. And I thought that was just before we moved on from these realizations, just to bring that moment up. I just love that moment.
I get the sense that was cathartic for you, Charles.
Yes, I was like, give me a break. And I think when you're writing someone who's dealing with leadership issues, authority issues, someone who's been trying to get approval from leadership figures, when she can finally just be like, enough, just stop. It's like something we don't get a lot of in fantasy, but it feels very cathartic when we do get it. So really great modern fantasy moment there that I just wanted to bring up before we went on to Rin's final decision here.
That's fair, Charles. It was interesting to see her push against the retroactive conclusions from the prophecy.
Yeah.
So she gets this interesting moment where, as Alton's sacrificing himself, he tells her that she's stronger than he ever was, which was interesting to hear from him.
Yeah.
And then she swims to Spear, and she basically gets this moment where she can completely unleash the Phoenix in a way that would, the way I read it, though I'm not sure if this is how it's supposed to be portrayed, but it's my sense, it would unleash the equivalent of almost an even bigger version of dropping an atomic bomb.
Right, like when she describes the cloud, it's very reminiscent of like a mushroom cloud and the way the color in the sky changed and just the level of catastrophe that occurred. It did harken back to and given her knowledge of like World War II era war, it seemed to me that it was very much a comparison to an atomic bomb, but it wiped out a whole nation. So
yes,
it must have been a way higher scale than an atomic bomb, for sure. That's an important moment that like we figured out the true nature behind Tirza, like that legend of how she chose to let the Spearleys die. She was like, that's the lesser sin here. It's like to deliberately choose to commit genocide of a people versus choosing to abstain from violence and letting what happens. And Rin was just like, I'm not going to let that happen to anyone I care about. I would sooner kill those people. And so she makes that deal with the gods. And I also like that Kuang took that moment with the gods to make that very distinct, like, the gods are like elements. They don't make decisions for you. You are consciously choosing to do this. Like, she was very deliberately like, this is you. This is a result of your will, basically.
I so much appreciate that Kuang drives that point home because she doesn't want us to have the excuse for Rin.
Yes.
Like, oh, we like Rin. She's human.
In no uncertain terms.
We want to think that it was the Phoenix's fault. But it was Rin's decision. And Kuang makes sure that you know that because, and I think this is such a big thing in this story, the theme is these atrocities get committed by people. If we view them as just pure evil with no humanity, then that is, relieving to feel that none of us are capable of committing evil like this.
Right.
But we see through Rin that you can have humanity and still commit this terrible atrocity deliberately.
Right. It's like the atomic bomb is a powerful weapon, but someone has to consciously make the decision to use those weapons. And so, I do appreciate Kuang's description of how the gods work and to interpret it as even the Phoenix was like, if you're choosing this, this is on you. Like, even the Phoenix god who's obsessed with destruction was like, know when you do this, that it's your fault. And she was like, okay, cool. And then we get the giant mushroom cloud of destruction, that complete genocide that is Rin's decision to destroy the enemy and all the people that live in that country, not even just the soldiers, but she makes a point to describe children and women and just like local towns, people that didn't even know there was a war going on. It's like she made that conscious description of exactly the scale in which she committed this act of violence. And only in fantasy can one character channel a power that wipes out an entire race and then has to deal with the fallout of it. It's a really interesting position.
Or at least in such an instantaneous way that can be so clearly one person's decision to do something so large.
Right.
And we don't get a lot more time in this book after that. We get some of Rin grappling with the ideas of what she's done, and there's a good moment where everyone around her is horrified by what she's done, and she is talking to Kite.
Yes,
Kite
that's
says,
what I wanted to make sure we talked about.
Yeah, so Rin says, they were monsters, they were not human. And Kite says, have you ever considered that was exactly what they thought of us?
Right.
And
great moment. And I feel like Kite, again, like he's like the voice of reason. And I think there's a very profound moment happening at the end of this book that I think will have repercussions. And I haven't read the next one, but I have a feeling that Kite is going to come back, and it's going to be under a different circumstance than when they were together in, Kite's home. It's now Kite has witnessed her commit this horrible war crime, and for Kite, it's unforgivable. He's like, please tell me that the god used you to commit this atrocity and that it wasn't you that willfully made this happen. And she was like, no point in lying about it. It was my will that made this happen. They were horrible people. You saw all the war crimes that they committed. And he was basically like, this was worse than anything else. Like, you just committed a genocide of a whole people. And he left. He left her at that moment, which I think Kuang did a great job of putting the weight of not only did she has to deal with pushing a button and a million people dying, but also the people around her are now leaving her. So the weight of that
exactly, Charles. Like you said, you resonated with Kite and
right.
what he stands for, and Kite is dealing with a lot of what we as readers are dealing with in that moment, which is trying to come to grips with the idea that someone in Rin that I would go so far as to say, or at least sympathize with.
Yeah, we've been rooting for her this whole time, for sure.
Exactly. Could do something so terrible, and he wants that out, like you were saying. Right. But Kuang and Rin aren't going to give us that out. We need to just sit with this. Right.
And the semantics of it are very important, and the fallout of it was super critical as well. It's just a really interesting situation that Rin now finds herself in at the end of this book. It's like, what's next? You're always asked the question, like, if you could push a button and it would kill all these people, what kind of effect would that have on you? You never got to meet them. You never got to know them. And Kuang explores this at the end of this book, and I imagine in much more detail in the next book, but of like, she basically pushed the button. She didn't actually go there and see anybody that she killed. The only witnessing thing she got to see was the mushroom cloud in the distance. So it's this interesting idea of sitting with the knowledge of what you did and slowly realizing I pushed this button and the war ends. Great. Boop. Done. Like, that's an easy thing. Someone as decisive as Rin would obviously make that choice. But now she's sitting with the cost of that. And it's such a huge, horrible thing that's so much bigger than just conceptualizing it right away. She's getting it in pieces. And every piece that she gets, it breaks her down a little bit more. And we only see the very beginnings of this with Kite leaving and with her crew being kind of unsure about her. And she starts to kind of go past the point of no return into this broken person. So really quite the arc for a first part of this trilogy. It's like, whoa. We've been through it all.
I know, Charles. one of the things I said when I was telling you why we have to read the Poppy War is that Kuang finds a way to get through what feels like a trilogy's worth of events and themes and drives them all home in only 500 some odd pages in a way that to me never felt rushed.
Right. No, her economy of words and her pacing were really great. She accomplished a lot and she earned every moment, and thoroughly impressed. And I think she set up a really great circumstance for book 2, where it's like now you have this character arc has been completed, where she goes from an ambitious youngster to like broken war criminal, right? It's a tragic arc. It's an arc of someone, going through the ringer and coming out a violent, horrible person. And now it's kind of like, well, how does she live with herself after this? There's still the Empress. There's still these other shamans out there. There's still troops on the ground and they're on their turf. So how does she come to terms with all of this, and does that affect how she continues her pursuit of revenge? And it's a great thought experiment that I'm looking forward to seeing how Kuang handles in the second book.
Well said, Charles.
Thank you.
I'm pumped to read the second book. I'm already maybe halfway through.
Okay, I'm about 5%. I cracked the cover.
Well, you had some catching up to do, and I've been trying to pace myself so we don't run into a little. I hope I remembered enough from this to make this conversation
well, we were
worthwhile.
Able to talk for 2.5 hours, so I think we're going to be fine.
Yeah, but it has been a few weeks for me since reading the first one. I've been trying to pace myself with.
I mean, you did forget the Gatekeeper, so.
I did forget the Gatekeeper. For that, I will never be forgiven.
Nope.
But we persevere, Charles, and I think it's on to book 2 for I assume our next buddy read discussion. You always know this stuff way more than I do.
Let's take a look at the schedule. So the schedule's changed so much, and it will continue to change. But basically, no. So
basically, no.
Yeah, we're dropping Poppy War Book 1, and then we still have to finish Lord of the Rings. So Lord of the Rings Book 3 will drop after this, and then we're going to have Poppy War Book 2. And then we go into The Witcher. So
things are getting really timey-wimey for us over here with the FTF podcast.
We had to move a lot around to accommodate Dylan, where we just had to read the Poppy War. And now, because we had to read it, here we are, much earlier than we've expected, dropping Poppy War. But you know what? You're going to get Poppy War. You're going to get Lord of the Rings. You're going to get Witcher. You're going to get Mark Lawrence. You're going to get Book of the Ancestor. And you're going to get Poppy War Book 3, which will be released as we're reading it. I mean, guys, that's a lot of high-stakes fantasy we're talking about here. We got a lot to cover.
And Charles, after we've gone through 2 episodes worth of discussion, I still hear a little of this snarkiness coming with we always have to accommodate Dylan, and it's totally fair. I know I have a history on our podcast of making you take time to do things that I've already done or whatnot, but I appreciate your flexibility as always, Charles.
Thank you kindly.
Are you really going to tell me it wasn't worth it?
I will say reading this book was a fun experience, especially after coming off of Lord of the Rings. Like I said, reading this was a delight. To go from old school to some of the most classic old school to some of the most fresh modern. Like, this series is cutting edge stuff. The next book's coming out in just a few weeks. So it was a very rewarding experience. And it was just nice to read something new. Get a character that feels fresh in fantasy as a protagonist, which you think you've read it all, especially after reading people like George and Rothfuss, and then Kuang comes in and still keeps it fresh. So, no, it was a great experience. I'm glad we did it this way. I'm glad we get to read book 3 when it comes out. It was all for the best. Like I said in our Have to Read episode, I was happy to do it. and we'll make it work, man. We're going to bring a lot of fantasy to the people in the next couple weeks.
I'm excited to do that with you, my buddy Charles.
And I'm excited to do it with my buddy over here, Dylan. Thank you for psyching me up for this and vetting it, I guess, and putting it on the table, because I would have never even heard of this book without your recommendations. So,
and now look at you, Charles,
now
making a podcast episode about it.
That's right. Well, anything else before I hit him with the outro?
Let's hit him with the outro.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to another exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. This has been part 2 of our Poppy War Book 1 Buddy Read discussion. This is the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang. Really fascinating stuff. Can't wait to get into that next book. If you like what you heard here, if you want to hear more, definitely check out our older library of stuff. Download all those episodes, follow us, subscribe to us, hit us up on social media at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, and at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end for Twitter. And rate us 5 stars, drop a hello on social media. Just let us know you're listening. And we really appreciate the time you put into listening to this, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Nailed it, Charles.
Nailed it. Well, won't keep you guys any longer. We'll just say for now, go forth and conquer, friends.